Good evening. I wonder how many of you today have your passports on you? And if you might just want to feel them in your pocket and maybe share with your neighbor or in your private thoughts what your feelings are about your passport. Do you have any? Does your heart start beating faster when you can feel its rugged surface in your pocket? Well, probably not. Probably most of you don't have any particular feelings about your passports. But if, on the other hand, you misplaced it, or if I told you that actually your government has just deprived you of your passport, that your passport is no longer valid, or in fact that the state which had issued your passport doesn't exist anymore, well, then you'd be in trouble. You probably wouldn't be able to make small, simple transactions. You also wouldn't be able to enroll in a university or do all sorts of more important things, like travel, visit your relatives, if your relatives happen to live in a different country. And many other things that you've got used to in your regular life would suddenly be evading you. Above all, you would be missing a link to a political community and thereby missing an identity. You would be joining the 10 million people today, of the 7 billion of the world's population, who don't have citizenship. And some of them also don't have a home. And in a sense, they not only lack that metaphorical fabric, the passport that links them to a political community, but also a real roof above their head. What they have instead, I brought this today, is a piece of tarpaulin, very often, which covers their head in makeshift camps for refugees, displaced persons, internment camps. And this is what I've been working on as a historian, on the history of statelessness in the 20th century, the history of those who missed the link to citizenship. It is to those, and the philosophers among them, that we actually owe our idea of the state, our modern idea of the state. Citizenship is the fundamental condition that gives us rights. It is the right to have rights that we obtain with citizenship. And many makers of this idea of the state, of citizenship, were themselves people without that right. Hannah Arendt, for example, didn't have citizenship for nearly 20 years. So did the makers of the comic strip Captain America. So why should we be interested in this story? Is this just an act of compassion that should compel us to study these people? Well, I suggest it's more than that. It's also a way of challenging our imagination and revisiting why it is that we tune our feelings so much to national flags. So from imagination and the story of compassion, we will get to a story of shared experience and the idea of what the state actually means to us. Why is it actually that we think that in addition to being fast runners or swimmers, we also need to cheer to national flags? What makes us think that our grammars of excellence should be so tuned to national criteria? I'm suggesting here that we should pose this piece of tarpaulin as a kind of question mark, right? Would we be able to whistle the Olympic tune and join perhaps 4 out of a total of 10,000 athletes who competed at the last Olympics who lacked citizenship? Only 4 out of 10,000 athletes were admitted to compete who don't have citizenship. Most of our competitions exclude the stateless because we don't think that statelessness is a condition that can invoke any kind of emotional sympathy. Where does this training come from? The stateless teach us to untrain, in a sense, our imagination and to think beyond the nation. In this image from the French Revolution, many of you will have seen it, we see this allegorical picture of liberty that guides the people. And liberty, for some reason, is carrying a national flag. Is this the only flag, do you think, that these people who are unhappy with their situation can be motivated by? Is it really only national kind of liberty that drives people to change their situation? Or could there be other links between them that motivate them? Another image we need to revisit and perhaps untrain is the idea that the state is always going to be that protective shield which will protect us from any dangers, that the state emerges, as the great 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes said, from a contract we sign with each other, and that it will enable mutual trust between us that would not actually exist without the state. Well, the experience of the 20th century teaches us that very frequently states actually turned against their own subjects. Up to 40 million civilians became victims of violence by states whose citizenship they once owned. So this crozier can very easily turn into a broom that purges its political communities, as you see here in the image. So what do we learn from the experience of statelessness in the 20th century? Well, one is that international communities and international organizations, like the League of Nations, did provide some makeshift attempt to identify those who had lost states, because these had disappeared, and they had given them passports that could be perhaps the equivalent of this blue tarpaulin, right? The passport for stateless people. But that passport didn't really provide an emotional connection. You don't really have any kind of emotional affinity to something that says that you lack something else, right? It doesn't identify you. So how did these people become a community? To what extent can we tell their story? And as I want to suggest, it's their ability to tell a story which ultimately saved many of their lives. Here's where we get to the historical account, and it gets messy. And what I want to suggest is that the reason why it gets messy is that even our interpretation of the past is actually guided by the idea of states and nations as the main agents of the historical process. States and nations are everywhere, as in this newspaper article, which suggests this particular scene. We are in World War II, we are here in the Irish Sea, where a German torpedo has hit a British warship, which was carrying, according to this newspaper article, Nazis to Canada. Now, if you look a bit more closely, a lot of these things don't really make sense. Why would the Germans torpedo other Germans? Or why would the Germans torpedo Nazis? Or perhaps the Germans were not Nazis, but in that case, why would they torpedo? So, in a way, the story either has to be reversed. Either you have to say the Nazis were torpedoing Nazis, in which case it sort of loses any kind of meaning. And anyway, why were the British transporting Nazis to Canada? The only way you can actually make sense of the story is if you look at it from the point of view of people themselves, of the stateless. So these so-called Nazis weren't actually Nazis. They were able to tell their story. I mean, those who survived among them and people who belonged to this community were able to tell their story. They were actually former citizens of Germany, Italy, and Austria, of Jewish background, who had been made stateless by Nazi Germany, fled to Britain, but were then interned in Britain because they were thought to be affiliated with an enemy state, in this case with Germany. So they were doubly stateless in a sense. They were denied their original citizenship, but then later they were not granted hospitality and instead actually interned as potential spies. Now, what do we learn from their experience? There are essentially two ideas that we can extract from the stories that these people tell. The first story is that, perhaps surprisingly, actually, the stateless do not become enemies of the idea of the state. On the contrary, they say that the state is our final and best resource that will still ensure our security. But they say that states can also run amok. They can turn against themselves. Literally, Germans can start torpedoing other Germans, and so on. In this case, it is actually almost right, this newspaper article. So what they're suggesting is that what saves people in this case is transnational connections, social networks, we would call them today, and the ability to tell a story about their situation, which will persuade communities to open their borders. In this case, the big tragedy is not a totalitarian state prosecuting its citizens. The tragedy is that a democratic state is suspecting people who are not suspect and who are not a threat. So transnational networks protect states in a situation where states fail. And in fact, hospitality ultimately benefits the hosts because it is the same organization that got enemy aliens out of internment, which later laid the foundations for social welfare provisions like the NHS in Britain. And the second point that these people teach us is that the ability to tell a story, to tell something negative into something positive, establishes sympathy, and from sympathy comes joint international action. And one of the stories that they told was the story of tarpaulin. It turns out that tarpaulin in English means not only this piece of tarred canvas, originally this was made of tarred canvas, but that actually tarpaulin is also the name for the lower class naval officers who rise to the rank of captain through skill and professionalism. And this ultimately is the main story that we learn from stateless people like this artist here who served in the resistance against the Nazi regime, and the social philosophers like Hannah Arendt, that states ultimately are the only organization that will provide us with the right to have rights, but that membership in that community is often also a matter of luck. So the story of statelessness is not just the story of victimhood with which we should have compassion. The stateless gave us the very idea of the state, and the stateless run marathons. Thank you.